Your purchase at the sheriff's sale is being invalidated due to procedural errors. We'll be breaking ground for the new development next month, announced Richard Thornton, sliding the eviction notice across Sarah Parker's kitchen table. The ESO, single mother of two, stared at the document that threatened to destroy her dream of restoring the old Whitfield farm she'd purchased at a sheriff's sale just 4 months earlier. But 6 weeks later, at a packed town council meeting, Thornton's confident smile vanished as Professor Emily Wilson stepped forward. Our investigation confirms that the concealed room Sarah Parker discovered behind the farmhouse's root cellar contains the original journals and printing press of Abigail Whitfield, the anonymous publisher of Liberty's Voice, who was instrumental in the Underground Railroad and whose written accounts are considered priceless historical documents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mapleton had once been known for its prosperous family farms, dotting the rolling hills of the Shenandoah Valley. For generations, farming families had worked the fertile land, following the rhythms of planting and harvest. The Whitfield farm, with its distinctive stone chimney and wraparound porch, had stood for nearly 2 centuries, marked by the original limestone fence posts. In recent years, as agricultural challenges mounted, many family farms had surrendered to foreclosure. Land once valued for crops suddenly became prized for luxury developments that promised tax revenue beyond what farming could provide. Sarah Parker, 34, had never intended to become a farmer. A librarian and single mother of twins, Emma and Ethan, she had been searching for an affordable home outside the city where her 8-year-old children could enjoy fresh air and open spaces. When the old Whitfield place appeared at a sheriff's sale at a surprisingly low price, she saw an opportunity she couldn't pass up. "It needs work," she admitted to her skeptical parents. "But the bones are good, and there's something about this. A place that just feels right." The farmhouse had stood empty for nearly a decade after the last Whitfield passed away without heirs, leaving unpaid taxes that forced the property into auction. The once productive 40 acres had become overgrown fields surrounding an aging farmhouse that most developers considered too costly to renovate. What Sarah saw was possibility: high ceilings, original hardwood floors beneath worn linoleum, and a solid structure that had weathered nearly 200 years. More importantly, she saw a place where her twins could have their own bedrooms and the childhood she had always wanted for them. The county had valued the property at $278,000, but years of back taxes had pushed the minimum bid down to $145,000. When auction day came, Sarah was shocked to find herself the only bidder. With trembling hands, she signed the papers and became the owner of the Whitfield farm for $152,000, nearly all her savings and inheritance from her grandmother. "You actually bought it?" her friend Beth asked in disbelief. "The place has been empty forever. What about the rumors?" "What rumors?" Sarah asked. "Just small-town talk. That the last Whitfield was strange, that the place has secrets." Sarah dismissed the comments as typical gossip. Her focus was on making the farmhouse livable before the school year started in September. Between her modest librarian's salary and her remaining savings, she had just enough for essential repairs. What Sarah couldn't know was that her purchase had interrupted carefully laid plans. Mapleton Valley Development Corporation, headed by Richard Thornton, had been systematically acquiring properties along the Eastern Ridge for a planned luxury community. The Whitfield farm occupied a key position that would provide the scenic backdrop for their marketing materials. Thornton had assumed the dilapidated farm would eventually fall into his company's hands when no one bid at the sheriff's sale. Sarah's unexpected purchase had been an irritating disruption to his timeline. 3 weeks after moving in, Sarah and the twins had settled into a rhythm of renovation and exploration. While contractors handled critical repairs, Sarah spent evenings stripping, wallpaper and weekends painting. The twins had claimed exploration of the property as their domain, discovering an old apple orchard and a small, spring-fed pond behind overgrown bushes. It was during one of these explorations that Emma made a discovery that would lead to something far more significant. "Mom, look what I found," she called, racing into the kitchen where Sarah was scraping decades of contact paper from cabinets. Emma held out a tarnished silver locket on a broken chain. "Where did you find this?" Sarah asked, carefully taking the antique piece by the old stone wall behind the garden. It was just sitting on top of one of the rocks. Sarah examined the locket, noting its intricate engraving and obvious age. When opened, it contained a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman in 19th century dress and a small paper with the initials A.W. A.W. could be a Whitfield, Sarah mused. This looks very old and might be meaningful to someone in town. That evening, Sarah showed the locket to Mabel Johnson, their 78-year-old neighbor who had lived adjacent to the Whitfield farm her entire life. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she examined it. "That's Abigail's," she whispered, looking up with sudden intensity. "Abigail Whitfield. She was the daughter of the original owner, born around 1820. Where exactly did you find this?" When Sarah explained, Mabel grew oddly quiet. The Whitfields were private people with complicated histories. That locket was thought lost generations ago. "Do you know more about Abigail?" Sarah asked. "Only what my grandmother told me," Mabel replied carefully. "She was educated, unusual for women then. She disappeared for several years and returned under mysterious circumstances. Some said she'd been to Philadelphia. The family never explained." The conversation left Sarah curious, but focused on more immediate concerns, like the root cellar that needed clearing. The following Saturday, she descended the narrow stairs into the damp space beneath the kitchen, armed with cleaning supplies. The root cellar was larger than expected, with stone walls and shelves carved into the earth. Decades of cobwebs shrouded glass jars with contents long since decayed. As Sarah cleared the far corner, she noticed something odd about the stone wall, a slight variation in the mortar color in a rectangular pattern. "That's strange," she murmured, running her fingers along the edge where the mortar changed. As she applied pressure, she felt a slight give. Heart quickening, she pressed harder and felt a distinct shift. "Emma, Ethan," she called, "bring me the flashlight from the kitchen drawer." With the twins watching wide-eyed from the steps, Sarah examined the wall more carefully. What had appeared to be solid stone was actually a disguised door, its edges concealed by expert masonry but betrayed by the slightly different-colored mortar. "It's a secret door," Ethan whispered, "like in Harry Potter." With trembling hands, Sarah pressed against the section. At first, nothing happened. But as she applied steady pressure and pushed to the left, the stone door grudgingly moved, revealing darkness beyond. The flashlight beam cut through centuries of undisturbed darkness, illuminating a small room lined with stone. This space had been deliberately sealed and hidden from casual discovery. As the light swept across the chamber, Sarah gasped. The room contained a small desk, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, and most remarkably, an antique printing press. Every surface was covered with dust, undisturbed for generations. "What is it, Mum?" Emma asked, peering anxiously from the doorway. "I'm not sure," Sarah replied honestly, "but I think we just found something very important." She carefully approached the desk, where several leather-bound books lay open, as if the occupant had stepped away only momentarily. The pages were covered in neat handwriting. The ink faded to brown. The date at the top read, April 15th, 1853. The wall hung a framed newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. The headline read, "Local woman charged with seditious writings. Publisher of Liberty's Voice remains unknown." Sarah's librarian training immediately kicked in. This wasn't just an interesting find. It was potentially significant historical evidence that required proper handling and documentation. As she ushered the twins back upstairs, promising to investigate with expert help, Sarah couldn't know that the hidden chamber would not only unravel the secret history of the Whitfield farm, but would ultimately become their salvation when forces beyond their control threatened their new home. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the silver locket with AW before her, connecting pieces of a puzzle. The Whitfield farm had harbored secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. And now, those secrets had been entrusted to her. The morning after finding the hidden chamber, Sarah woke before dawn, her mind racing with questions about what lay beneath her new home. Instead of tackling the planned kitchen renovation, she found herself drawn back to the root cellar. Standing in the hidden room, as early light filtered through the narrow ground-level window, she studied the space with growing amazement, not just as an unusual discovery, but as a deliberate creation that someone had painstakingly concealed. The printing press dominated the small space, a cast-iron hand press, its mechanisms frozen with age but remarkably intact. Sarah recognized it as a Washington-style press, the kind used by small newspaper operations and pamphlet printers in the mid-19th century. As a librarian with a minor in American history, she understood enough to recognize its historical significance, but not enough to fully assess what she'd found. This wasn't just hidden, she murmured to herself, running her hand along the dust-covered desk. It was preserved. Sarah examined the room more carefully in the daylight. The stone walls had been expertly fitted to prevent moisture damage. Small glass containers still held dried-out ink. The bookshelves contained not only journals, but bound collections of what appeared to be the mysterious Liberty's Voice publication mentioned in the newspaper clipping, each volume carefully labeled by year from 1850 to 1863. As Sarah moved through the space, disturbing decades of settled dust, she was struck by the deliberate nature of the concealment. Whoever had sealed this room had intended it to be found eventually, but only by someone who would appreciate its significance. Later that morning, Sarah called the one person she thought might help make sense of her discovery. Dr. Daniel Freeman had been her favorite professor in college and now served as the history department chair at the State University. At 62, he was a recognized expert on Civil War-era publications and social movements. A hidden printing press and journals from the 1850s, Dr. Freeman said, his voice rising with interest when Sarah explained her discovery. "And you say this was on the old Whitfield property? That's potentially very significant." "The newspapers mention something called Liberty's Voice," Sarah added. "Does that mean anything to you?" The line went silent for a moment. "Are you absolutely certain that's what it said?" Dr. Freeman finally asked, his tone now deadly serious. "Yes, I have a photo of the clipping on my phone. I can send it to you. Please do. Immediately." The urgency in his voice caught Sarah off guard. "And Sarah, don't mention this discovery to anyone else yet. If this is what I think it might be, you've stumbled onto something of extraordinary historical importance." Within minutes of receiving Sarah's photo, Dr. Freeman called back. "I'm rearranging my schedule. I can be there tomorrow morning. This chamber needs to be properly documented before anything is disturbed." "It's that significant?" Liberty's Voice was a notorious abolitionist publication that circulated throughout Virginia and Maryland in the decade before the Civil War, Dr. Freeman explained. It published first-hand accounts from escaped slaves, critiques of the Fugitive Slave Act, and philosophical arguments against slavery, all at a time when such publications were not just controversial, but actively dangerous for those involved in their production. "And you think this was where it was printed?" Sarah asked, glancing toward the root cellar door. The publisher of Liberty's Voice was never identified, despite considerable efforts by authorities to silence it. "If you've found its origin point, preserved intact," he paused. "Sarah, this would be comparable to discovering a perfectly preserved underground railroad station, complete with documentation. It's an extraordinary historical find." The following morning, Dr. Freeman arrived accompanied by Dr. Amara Washington, a specialist in African American history focused on abolitionist movements. As Sarah led them to the hidden chamber, she explained how she had discovered the locket, first, which had indirectly led to finding the secret room, the initials AW. "Abigail Whitfield," Dr. Washington noted as she examined the locket Sarah had placed on the kitchen table. "The timing would align perfectly. She would have been in her early 30s during the peak years of Liberty's Voice publication." In the hidden chamber, both historians moved with careful reverence, documenting everything with photographs before touching any artifacts. Dr. Freeman examined the printing press while Dr. Washington carefully studied the journals. "This is incredible," Dr. Washington breathed, gently turning pages with a gloved hand. "These aren't just publication records. These are Abigail's personal journals documenting her work with the Underground Railroad. Names, dates, coded language about passengers and stations. The press is definitely the right model for producing Liberty's Voice," Dr. Freeman confirmed. "And look at this. Hidden compartments in the desk containing different printing plates. She could quickly switch from printing innocuous materials to producing the controversial publication if needed." For hours, they carefully examined and catalogued the chamber's contents, their initial excitement giving way to deep professional focus. Sarah assisted, following their instructions for proper handling and documentation. "What's truly remarkable is the preservation," Dr. Washington explained. "Whoever sealed this room did so expertly. Low humidity, no light exposure, temperature relatively constant. It's as if they created a time capsule deliberately designed to survive until it could be safely revealed." As they worked, Dr. Freeman shared what was known about Liberty's Voice and its anonymous publisher. The publication had first appeared in 1850, shortly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. It had circulated primarily through secret networks of abolitionists, but occasionally found its way into mainstream society, causing considerable controversy. "Authorities were desperate to identify the publisher," he explained. "The writing was sophisticated, showing classical education that was unusual for the period, especially given the content. Some suspected a northern academic writing under a pseudonym. Others thought it might be the work of several authors presenting as one. But it was Abigail Whitfield all along," Sarah mused, carefully examining a portrait they'd found among the journals, clearly the same young woman from the locket photograph. "It appears so," Dr. Washington agreed. "And from these journals, we can see she had help, a network of collaborators who distributed the publication while keeping her identity secret. By mid-afternoon, they had documented the most significant artifacts and developed a preliminary preservation plan." Dr. Freeman made several calls to colleagues at the State Historical Society, arranging for conservation experts to properly assess the materials. "Sarah, I cannot overstate the historical significance of what you've discovered," Dr. Freeman said, as they sat at her kitchen table reviewing their findings. "This is a major historical discovery that will reshape our understanding of abolitionist activism in this region." "What happens next?" Sarah asked, still processing the magnitude of her discovery. "With your permission, we'd like to bring in a professional conservation team to properly preserve these materials," Dr. Washington explained. "The journals, the printing press, and particularly the complete collection of Liberty's Voice, these are irreplaceable historical treasures. Of course, Sarah agreed readily, but they'd remain here, right? On the property where they were created? The historians exchanged glances. Ideally, yes, Dr. Freeman said carefully. The historical context of the location adds significant value. A preserved site with original artifacts in their original location would be the best outcome from a historical perspective. But, Sarah prompted, sensing his hesitation. But proper preservation requires controlled environmental conditions, security and ongoing maintenance, Dr. Washington explained. That would require significant funding and infrastructure that's typically beyond what a private homeowner can provide. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the implications. Her discovery was too significant to remain simply a private curiosity. In her basement, it belonged in some sense to history itself. There might be grants available for historical preservation, Dr. Freeman suggested, seeing Sarah's expression. The site could potentially qualify for designation on the National Register of Historic Places, which would open up preservation funding options. As they continued discussing possibilities, Sarah's phone chimed with a text message from the contractor. She'd hired for the kitchen renovation. County says there's an issue with your permits. All work stopped until resolved. Call ASAP. Sarah frowned at the message. She'd carefully filed all the necessary paperwork weeks ago, and the initial permits had already been approved. This sudden issue seemed suspiciously timed. What she couldn't know was that news of unusual activity at the Whitfield farm, specifically the arrival of recognized historians, had already reached Richard Thornton. The developer had immediately activated his connections at the county offices to gather information and potentially create obstacles. As Sarah called the contractor to get details, Dr. Washington continued examining the portrait of Abigail Whitfield. There's something familiar about her features, she mused, something I've seen before in my research. While Sarah dealt with the permit issue, Dr. Freeman turned his attention to the leather-bound editions of Liberty's Voice. Opening the U's earliest volume from 1850, he found an inscription written in elegant script on the inside cover, "Let truth be told, that freedom may follow. A.W." Beneath it, in a different hand, someone had added, "The truth remains hidden until the world is ready to hear it. The key lies with the seventh generation. E.W., 1899. E.W., Dr. Freeman murmured. That would be Ezra Whitfield, Abigail's nephew who inherited the farm after her death. He must have been the one who sealed the room. Dr. Washington looked up from the portrait. The seventh generation from Abigail would be, she quickly calculated, potentially alive today. Did Abigail have descendants? According to my neighbor Mabel, the Whitfield line ended with the last owner who died without heirs, Sarah said, rejoining them after finishing her call. That's why the property went to auction. Perhaps not by the Whitfield name, Dr. Washington suggested. But there might be descendants through other lines, perhaps female descendants whose surnames changed. As the historians prepared to leave with their preliminary documentation, arranging to return with the conservation team in 2 days, Sarah walked them to their car. The uneasy feeling about the suddenly revoked permits had grown stronger, particularly when the contractor mentioned that the official he'd spoken with had asked specifically about any historical features on the property. One last thing, Dr. Freeman said before departing. If anyone from the county or any developers contact you about the property, please let me know immediately. Historical finds like this can become complicated when development interests are involved. You think someone might try to interfere with the preservation? Sarah asked. It wouldn't be the first time, Dr. Washington replied grimly. Historical preservation and development often find themselves at odds, especially when valuable land is involved. As their car disappeared down the long driveway, Sarah turned back toward the farmhouse, her mind swirling with the day's revelations. The humble home she'd purchased as a fresh start for her family had revealed itself to be something far more significant, a hidden chapter of American history preserved for generations, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. What Sarah couldn't yet understand was that her discovery had set in motion forces beyond her control, forces that would soon place her and her children in direct conflict with powerful interests that viewed history as an inconvenient obstacle to profit. That evening, as the twins excitedly examined photographs of the artifacts under Sarah's careful supervision, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Through the front window, Sarah recognized the county assessor's car pulling into her driveway, followed closely by a luxury SUV she'd never seen before. The battle for the Whitfield farm and the historical treasure it contained was about to begin in earnest. "Miss Parker, I'm Thomas Grant from the county assessor's office," announced the man in the pressed shirt and tie. "And this is Mr. Thornton from Mapleton Valley Development. We need to discuss some irregularities with your property purchase." Sarah stood in her doorway, blocking their view into the house where Emma and Ethan were finishing dinner. "What kind of irregularities? My paperwork was all in order at the sheriff's sale." "May we come in?" Thornton asked with practiced politeness, already moving toward the door as if her consent was a foregone conclusion. "Actually, this isn't a good time," Sarah replied firmly. "I'd be happy to schedule a meeting at the county offices tomorrow." Thornton's smile tightened. "This is somewhat urgent, Miss Parker. It's come to our attention that there may have been procedural errors in the auction process that could affect your ownership status." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she maintained her composure. "If there's a formal concern, please send it in writing to my attorney. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get my children ready for bed." As she closed the door, she caught Thornton's calculating glance toward the direction of the root cellar entrance. Someone had clearly informed him about the historian's visit and their discovery. Inside, Sarah immediately called Dr. Freeman, explaining the unexpected visit. "They're claiming there were procedural errors with the auction," she concluded. "This can't be a coincidence." "It's not," Dr. Freeman confirmed grimly. "I've made some inquiries. Thornton's company has been systematically acquiring properties throughout Mapleton Valley for a massive development project. The Whitfield farm sits at a crucial location that would complete their planned community. But they can't just invalidate a legal purchase, can they?" "Not legitimately," Dr. Freeman replied, "but they can create delays, bureaucratic obstacles, and pressure. From what I've learned, Thornton has considerable influence with certain county officials." "What should I do?" "First, we need to accelerate the historical designation process. I've already contacted the State Historic Preservation Office with preliminary documentation. Dr. Washington has reached out to colleagues at the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. After ending the call, Sarah checked her email to find a formal notice from the county claiming that documentation irregularities required a review of her property purchase. The notice mentioned a hearing scheduled in just 5 days, an unusually expedited timeline that further confirmed Thornton's influence. The following morning, Sarah drove to the county courthouse, determined to understand exactly what irregularities were being claimed. At the records office, the clerk seemed unusually uncomfortable when Sarah requested the complete file related to the Whitfield property auction. "Those records are currently being audited," the clerk explained nervously. "I can't access them until the review is complete." "When will that be?" "I couldn't say. The special review was ordered yesterday by Commissioner Davis." "Is it normal for property records to become suddenly unavailable right after a purchase?" Sarah pressed. The clerk glanced around before lowering her voice. "Between us, no. I've worked here 12 years and never seen it happen, but when requests come from upstairs..." She trailed off meaningfully, nodding toward the commissioner's office. Sarah's next stop was the office of Janet Chen, a real estate attorney recommended by Dr. Freeman. After reviewing the situation, Janet's assessment was blunt. "They're manufacturing a crisis to pressure you into selling," she explained. "The procedural errors claim is vague enough to create uncertainty, but difficult to disprove if they're restricting access to the records. So what can we do?" "Two things simultaneously," Janet advised. "First, we challenge their legal maneuvering with our own. I'll file a motion to dismiss their review for lack of specificity and demand immediate access to all relevant records. And second, we use the historical significance as leverage. If the property receives historical designation before they can invalidate your purchase, it becomes much more difficult for them to proceed with development plans." As they developed their strategy, Janet's assistant entered with breaking news. Mapleton Valley Development had just issued a press release announcing a major new community development that prominently featured renderings showing luxury homes on what was clearly the Whitfield property. "They're creating momentum," Janet observed grimly, "making their development seem inevitable to increase pressure on you and potentially influence the county commissioners who'll hear your case." That afternoon, Sarah returned home to find Dr. Washington waiting with an elderly man who introduced himself as Benjamin Johnson, Mabel's son and a local historian. "Dr. Washington contacted me about Abigail Whitfield," Benjamin explained as they sat on Sarah's porch. "I've been researching local history for decades, and the Whitfield connection to the Underground Railroad has always been rumored, but never proven, until now." He handed Sarah a faded photograph showing the Whitfield farm circa 1890. This was taken after Abigail's death, when her nephew Ezra had inherited the property. Note the stone markers along the eastern boundary. Sarah studied the image, seeing the same limestone posts that still stood on her property. "Those weren't just boundary markers," Benjamin explained. "According to local oral history, they were directional guides for the Underground Railroad. Their positioning aligned with other safe houses in the region." Dr. Washington nodded. "The journal entries confirm it. Abigail was not just publishing Liberty's voice. She was actively helping escaped slaves travel north to freedom. The farm was a key station in the local Underground Railroad network." This revelation added another layer of historical significance to Sarah's discovery. As they continued discussing the historical connections, Emma burst from the house, eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, I found something else," she exclaimed, holding out a tarnished metal object. "It was under the floorboard in my room when I dropped my pencil through the crack." Sarah carefully took the item, a small brass key with an unusual design on its head. "May I?" Dr. Washington asked, examining it closely. "This symbol, it matches one used in Liberty's voice as a signature mark. Where exactly did you find this, Emma?" The child led them upstairs to her bedroom, where a floorboard had indeed come loose. Beneath it was a small, hollow space containing a metal box about the size of a thick book. With trembling hands, Sarah tried the key. It fit perfectly, turning with a well-preserved click despite the decades. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope with "For the 7th generation," written in faded ink. Dr. Washington carefully opened the ledger to reveal meticulous records of people who had passed through the Whitfield farm on their journey to freedom. Names, dates, and destinations, all recorded in Abigail's distinctive handwriting. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Washington whispered. "A complete record of Abigail's work with the Underground Railroad. This alone would be historically priceless." Sarah carefully opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a letter dated October 15, 1870. "To the finder of this record, if you are reading this, you have discovered the truth I was forced to conceal during my lifetime. My work with Liberty's voice and the assistance I provided to those escaping bondage were kept secret of necessity, for such actions were considered crimes by the laws of men, though justified by the higher law of conscience. I have instructed my nephew Ezra to seal my printing room and preserve these records when I am gone, to be revealed when our nation has evolved beyond the prejudices that make such secrecy necessary. The full accounting of my work is contained in my journals and in this ledger. The true history of this farm is one of resistance against injustice. May whoever owns this land in the future honor its legacy. Abigail Whitfield, the letter continued, with specific instructions about the preservation of her records and printing press, revealing that Abigail had deliberately created the hidden chamber as a time capsule, hoping that future generations would understand and value her dangerous work. "This changes everything," Dr. Washington said, after they had documented the new discoveries. "With this letter and ledger, along with the preserved printing press and journals, the historical case becomes undeniable. This property represents a unique and irreplaceable piece of American history." That evening, as Sarah updated Dr. Freeman and Janet Chen about the new discoveries, the attorney's assessment was optimistic. "This strengthens our position significantly," Janet confirmed. "I'll immediately file for emergency historical designation based on these new findings. The Underground Railroad connection, with physical evidence and documentation, should qualify for expedited consideration." Sarah felt a growing sense of purpose about her role as the unexpected guardian of Abigail's legacy. What had begun as a simple search for an affordable home had evolved into something far more meaningful, a chance to preserve and share a courageous woman's contributions to justice and freedom. The following morning brought another unexpected visitor. Mabel Johnson hobbled up the porch steps with the help of a cane, her son Benjamin at her side. "I should have told you everything from the beginning," she said as Sarah helped her into a chair. "When you found Abigail's locket, I knew the time had come, but I wasn't sure if you were the right person." "The right person for what?" Sarah asked. "To protect Abigail's legacy," Mabel replied. "There's something you need to know. The Whitfield bloodline didn't end with the last owner, as most people believe. It continued through a different name, through my mother's line." Benjamin nodded. "Ezra Whitfield's daughter married a Johnson. Their daughter was my mother. We are the 6th generation from Abigail Whitfield. Then the 7th generation would be," Sarah began. "My daughter," Benjamin confirmed. "Catherine Johnson Rodriguez, who lives in Boston. She's a historian specializing in 19th century women's activism." "The letter was addressed to the 7th generation," Sarah said, remembering Abigail's words. "Yes," Mabel agreed. "Family legend. Always said Abigail left something important that would be revealed when the time was right. We knew about her abolitionist sympathies, but had no proof of her activities. The farm passed out of the family when my cousin Alfred died, without children, and we couldn't afford to buy it from the estate." "But why didn't you bid at the sheriff's sale?" Sarah asked. "We tried," Benjamin explained, "but suddenly the auction date was changed with minimal notice, too late for us to arrange financing. We suspected manipulation then, but couldn't prove it." This new information added yet another dimension to the increasingly complex situation. As they discussed the family connection, Sarah's phone rang. Janet Chen was calling with urgent news. "The county has accelerated the hearing to tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., the attorney reported. "It's a blatant attempt to rush the process before we can secure historical designation. And there's more. According to my sources, Commissioner Davis has already privately assured Thornton that the hearing will go in the development company's favor." "They can't simply invalidate a legal purchase, can they?" Sarah asked, alarm rising in her voice. "They're claiming they discovered the auction notice wasn't properly advertised in all required publications, making the entire process legally questionable," Janet explained. It's a technicality, but one that could potentially force a new auction, which Thornton would ensure he wins. What can we do? I'm filing emergency motions, but we need to accelerate the historical designation process. Has Dr. Freeman made any progress with the State Historic Preservation Office? Sarah glanced at Benjamin and Mabel, a new idea forming. I think we might have an even stronger case than before. The Whitfield descendants have come forward. As Sarah explained the Johnson family connection, Janet's tone shifted from concern to cautious optimism. A direct family connection to Abigail Whitfield, combined with the discovered artifacts and historical documentation, significantly strengthens our position. I'll contact Catherine Rodriguez immediately for a statement supporting the historical designation. By nightfall, the situation had escalated into a full-blown race against time. Thornton had arranged for construction equipment to be delivered to a staging area visible from Sarah's property, a clear intimidation tactic suggesting that development was imminent and inevitable. Meanwhile, Dr. Freeman and Dr. Washington had mobilized colleagues from 3 universities and the State Historical Society to prepare comprehensive documentation for the emergency historical designation application. Catherine Rodriguez was flying in from Boston, bringing family records that might further establish the property's significance. As Sarah tucked her children into bed that night, Emma asked the question that had been lingering unspoken. "Mom, are we going to lose our house?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know exactly what will happen tomorrow, sweetie. But I do know that we found something important that needs to be protected. Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks, like Abigail did," Emma asked. "Dr. Washington said she was brave because she helped people even when it was dangerous." "Yes, exactly like that," Sarah replied, smoothing Emma's hair. "And now it's our turn to be brave for her." After the children were asleep, Sarah sat on the porch swing, watching the distant lights of Thornton's construction equipment on the ridge. The farm felt different now, no longer just a fixer-upper she'd impulsively purchased, but a place with profound meaning and purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Catherine Rodriguez landed, meeting with state preservation officials. Tonight, hearing still on for 9 a.m. Be ready. Sarah gazed out at the dark silhouettes of the limestone posts marking the boundaries of the property, posts that she now understood had once guided desperate travelers to safety. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, but with it came a strange sense of clarity. Whatever happened at tomorrow's hearing, she knew she was now part of something much larger than herself, a continuing story of courage and principle that had begun with Abigail Whitfield nearly 2 centuries earlier. The farm had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. As midnight approached, lights appeared on the gravel driveway. Catherine Rodriguez had arrived with Dr. Washington, bringing hope and perhaps the key to preserving Abigail's legacy against the forces that sought to erase it. The county hearing room buzzed with unusual activity for an early weekday morning. Local reporters sat in the back row, alerted by Thornton's press release about the major development announcement. County employees whispered among themselves, sensing the tension as Sarah entered with Janet Chen and Dr. Freeman. Richard Thornton sat confidently at the respondents' table, flanked by 2 corporate attorneys in expensive suits. He nodded curtly. To Sarah, his expression suggesting the outcome was already determined. "Quite a turnout for a simple procedural review," Janet muttered, noting the packed room. "Thornton's making this a public spectacle to increase pressure." Commissioner Davis called the hearing to order, his demeanor formal, but his eyes avoiding Sarah's. "We're here to address potential irregularities in the sheriff's sale of the former Whitfield property," he began. "Our review has identified several procedural concerns that may invalidate the auction results." Janet immediately rose. Before we proceed, we need to address a significant legal development. My client's property has been submitted for emergency consideration under the National Historic Preservation Act as a site of exceptional historical significance. That submission has no bearing on this proceeding, interjected Thornton's attorney. Pending applications don't create any legal impediment to the county's review authority. Commissioner Davis nodded in agreement. While Ms. Parker is certainly entitled to seek historical designation, it doesn't impact our determination regarding the auction's validity. Janet remained standing. We also have evidence suggesting the alleged procedural errors were deliberately manufactured to benefit Mapleton Valley Development. This accusation caused a stir in the room. Commissioner Davis rapped his gavel. That's a serious allegation, Counselor, and not relevant to today's proceeding. Please be seated. For the next 20 minutes, the county attorney methodically outlined the claimed procedural errors, technicalities about notification requirements and publication deadlines. Each point seemed minor in isolation, but collectively created the impression of a flawed process. Given these irregularities, the county attorney concluded, we recommend the sale be invalidated and the property returned to sheriff's auction with proper adherence to all procedural requirements. Thornton's satisfied expression confirmed what everyone suspected. He had already arranged to be the successful bidder in any new auction. As Janet rose to present their response, the hearing room doors opened. Dr. Washington entered, accompanied by an elegant woman in her 50s and a distinguished man in a dark suit carrying an official-looking portfolio. Apologies for the interruption, Dr. Washington announced. I'm Dr. Amara Washington from the State University, and this is Catherine Rodriguez, direct descendant of Abigail Whitfield, and Director James Marshall from the State Historic Preservation Office. Commissioner Davis frowned at the disruption. This hearing is already in progress. Commissioner, Director Marshall interjected firmly, approaching the bench. I need to inform you that as of 7:30 this morning, the Whitfield farm has been granted emergency designation on the State Register of Historic Places, with expedited consideration for the National Register. He placed official documents before the Commissioner. Furthermore, the site has received preliminary designation in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Program based on the exceptional artifacts and documentation discovered on the property. A murmur swept through the room as reporters began taking notes more vigorously. Thornton leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorneys. While I appreciate this information, Commissioner Davis said stiffly, it doesn't directly impact the procedural review of the property sale. With respect, Commissioner, it absolutely does, Director Marshall replied. State law explicitly prohibits any action that would jeopardize a designated historic site, including questioning established ownership without substantial cause. Catherine Rodriguez stepped forward. As Abigail Whitfield's direct descendant and a historian specializing in women's activism, I can attest to the extraordinary significance of what Sarah Parker has discovered. This site represents a unique and irreplaceable piece of American history. Commissioner Davis looked increasingly uncomfortable as the dynamic in the room shifted. Perhaps we should recess briefly to review these new documents. If I may, Janet interjected, we have additional evidence directly relevant to the procedural concerns raised today. She distributed folders to the commissioners. These records, obtained from the state archives, conclusively show that the auction notice for the Whitfield property was indeed published in all required outlets, on the legally mandated schedule. How did you obtain these? The county attorney demanded. Our records show. That's precisely our concern, Janet interrupted. "The county records relating to this property were mysteriously unavailable immediately after my client raised questions about Mr. Thornton's interest in the property. These archived copies demonstrate that the claimed procedural errors simply don't exist." As the commissioners reviewed the documents, Thornton rose abruptly. "This is becoming a circus rather than a proper hearing. I move that we postpone until all these tangential matters can be sorted out." "What Mr. Thornton means," Janet replied, coolly, "is that he'd prefer to delay until he can find another avenue to seize control of historically significant property for commercial development." Before Thornton could respond, Catherine Rodriguez spoke again. "There's something else the commissioners should know. My family has filed a formal ethics complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding the manipulation of this property's auction process." She held up a folder of her own. "We have documentation showing that the auction date was changed with minimal notice after my family expressed interest in purchasing our ancestral home, a change that coincidentally occurred immediately following a private meeting between Commissioner Davis and Mr. Thornton." The room erupted in whispers as Commissioner Davis paled visibly. "These allegations are completely unfounded." "Commissioner," Director Marshall cut in, "given the state designation and these new allegations, I strongly advise against any action invalidating Ms. Parker's purchase. Doing so could potentially violate multiple state preservation statutes and trigger a full investigation by our office and potentially the Attorney General." Thornton and his attorneys huddled in urgent consultation, while the commissioners whispered among themselves. The momentum had shifted dramatically, and everyone in the room could feel it. After several tense minutes, Commission Chairwoman Wilson, who had been notably silent until now, spoke up. "In light of these significant new developments, I move that we dismiss the procedural review and affirm the validity of the original sheriff's sale. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates that all required notifications were properly made." Despite Commissioner Davis's visible discomfort, the motion passed 4-1. Sarah's purchase of the Whitfield farm would stand. As the hearing adjourned, Thornton approached Sarah, his earlier confidence replaced by barely contained frustration. "This isn't over, Ms. Parker. Historical designation or not, that property remains crucial to our development plans. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, well above market value." "The farm isn't for sale, Mr. Thornton," Sarah replied firmly. "It was entrusted to me, and I intend to honor that trust." "Everyone has a price," Thornton insisted. "Name yours. 1 million? 2? Think about what that would mean for your children's future." Sarah considered his words, genuinely tempted by the financial security such an amount would provide. But then she thought of Abigail Whitfield's courage and the legacy she had protected at great personal risk. "Some things aren't about price, Mr. Thornton. They're about value, and those aren't the same thing." As Thornton stalked away, Catherine Rodriguez approached Sarah, extending her hand. "Thank you for protecting my great-great-great-grandmother's legacy. When we lost the farm after Alfred's death, I thought Abigail's story might be lost forever." "I feel like I was meant to find it," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not sure what happens next. Preserving everything properly will take resources I don't." That's why I'm here," Director Marshall joined them. "The state designation opens numerous funding opportunities for preservation and restoration. And given the exceptional nature of the discovery, several private foundations have already expressed interest in supporting the project." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Dr. Washington and Catherine as they explained the historical significance of the Whitfield farm discovery. The story of Abigail Whitfield, educated woman, secret publisher, and Underground Railroad conductor, was emerging from the shadows of history, captivating public imagination. Sarah stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching as her private. Discovery became a public story. Emma and Ethan, who had been brought to the courthouse by Benjamin after the hearing concluded, joined her with wide eyes. "Does this mean we get to keep our house?" Emma asked hopefully. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, hugging her children close. "And it means we have an important job to do, helping people learn about Abigail and the brave work she did." That afternoon, as they returned to the farmhouse, Sarah found a small gathering waiting on her porch. Dr. Freeman, Dr. Washington, Catherine Rodriguez, and several other historians and preservation experts, all eager to begin the formal documentation process. "We've established a preliminary preservation plan," Dr. Freeman explained as they walked toward the root cellar. "The first phase involves creating proper climate control for the hidden chamber and professionally cataloging all artifacts." "What about the house itself?" Sarah asked. "I still have to make it livable for my family." "That's where the historical designation helps," Director Marshall explained. "There are specific grants for homeowners of historic properties that would cover much of your renovation costs, provided the work preserves the historical character." As the experts discussed technical details, Catherine took Sarah aside. "When I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell me stories about Abigail, how she was brilliant but had to hide her true work, how she risked everything to fight against injustice. I became a historian largely because of those stories, but I never imagined finding actual proof of her activities. It must be overwhelming to suddenly have your family history confirmed and made public," Sarah observed. Catherine nodded. "It is, but it's also incredibly validating. Abigail's voice, which was silenced for so long, can finally be heard." As dusk fell, the visitors departed, leaving Sarah alone with her children in the suddenly quiet farmhouse. She stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the old limestone fence posts with golden light. The same light had fallen on those posts when they guided frightened travelers to safety, when Abigail had risked everything to print words of freedom in her hidden press. Sarah's phone chimed with a text from Janet. "Thornton just withdrew all. Permit applications for the Ridge development. Local paper wants to interview you tomorrow." The immediate threat had passed, but Sarah knew that preserving Abigail's legacy would be a lifelong commitment. The farmhouse that had begun as an impulsive purchase, a place to raise her children, had become something far more significant. It was now a living historical site, a testament to one woman's courage and a responsibility that would shape Sarah's life in ways she was only beginning to understand. That evening, as she tucked her children into bed, Ethan asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mum, do you think Abigail would be happy we found her secret room?" Sarah paused, considering. "I think she would. She preserved everything so carefully, hoping someone would discover it when the time was right. I think she'd be proud that her story can finally be told. And we get to be part of her story now, right?" Emma added sleepily. "Yes, we do," Sarah replied softly. "We're a new chapter in a very old story." Later that night, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, reading through copies of Abigail's journals by lamplight. The words, written more than 150 years earlier, resonated with passion, intelligence, and unwavering moral conviction. One passage in particular caught her attention. "I write, not knowing if these words will ever find their intended audience. I imprint truths that many wish to silence, but I persist in the faith that someday the world will be ready to hear what must be said, and someone will find what I have hidden and understand its worth." Sarah closed the journal, overwhelmed by the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place at this moment in history. She had come looking for a home for her children, and found instead a mission, becoming the custodian of a legacy that had waited generations to be revealed. Through the window, she could see the ancient limestone posts marking the boundaries of the property, standing firm against the darkness. They had withstood nearly 2 centuries of weather and change, their purpose hidden in plain sight all along. Now they would stand as silent witnesses to a new chapter in the farm's long history, one where secrets became stories and a forgotten voice finally found its audience. What Sarah Parker couldn't know, as she prepared for bed in the house that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it, was how profoundly the discovery in the root cellar would transform not just her life and her children's futures, but the historical understanding of resistance and courage in a dark chapter of American history. The confrontation with Thornton had been won, but the true work of honoring Abigail Whitfield's legacy was just beginning. 6 months after the Courthouse confrontation, the Whitfield farm had undergone a remarkable transformation. The weathered farmhouse now stood proudly with a fresh coat of historically accurate white paint, its wraparound porch meticulously restored to 19th century specifications. The sagging roof had been replaced, the stone chimney repointed, and the original windows carefully refurbished rather than replaced, all funded through historic preservation grants. But the most significant changes weren't visible from the outside. The root cellar's hidden chamber had been professionally preserved, its precious contents catalogued and protected while remaining in their original location. A climate control system had been discreetly installed, ensuring the delicate papers and printing materials would survive for generations to come. Sarah stood on the porch, watching as a small tour group followed Catherine Rodriguez toward the newly constructed visitor center, a tasteful building designed to complement the historic farmhouse while providing space for exhibits and educational programs. The sound of hammering came from the old barn, where restoration specialists were completing the final phase of structural repairs. "It still feels surreal sometimes," Sarah said to Dr. Washington, who had joined her for the day's first tour. 6 months ago, I was just trying to create a home for my kids. Now we're running a historical site," Dr. Washington smiled, "and doing an extraordinary job of it. The Whitfield Farm project is already being cited as a model for how to preserve historical sites while keeping them as living, functioning spaces." The designation of the Whitfield Farm as a site on the National Register of Historic Places had opened doors that Sarah never could have imagined. The initial emergency grants for preservation had been followed by substantial funding from historical societies, educational foundations, and private donors captivated by Abigail's story. Catherine Rodriguez had leveraged her academic connections to secure a major grant from her university specifically for creating educational programming around women's roles in the abolitionist movement. Most significantly, the Whitfield Heritage Foundation had been established with Sarah, Catherine, and Dr. Washington as founding board members. The foundation now owned the land and buildings with a permanent conservation easement, ensuring they could never be developed, while a special provision granted Sarah lifetime residency rights in the farmhouse itself. "Mom, the school bus is here," Emma called, racing around the corner of the house. At 10, she had embraced her role as the youngest unofficial tour guide, proudly showing visiting children the secret doorway that had changed their lives. Sarah watched as a yellow school bus rolled up the newly restored gravel driveway. Today's visitors were 5th graders from an elementary school 30 miles away, part of the educational outreach program that brought students to learn about the Underground Railroad and the power of the written word in the fight against slavery. "Ready for another group?" Dr. Washington asked. "Always," Sarah replied. As a former librarian, she had found unexpected fulfillment in sharing Abigail's story with young people. She had reduced her hours at the county library to part-time, allowing her to devote 3 days a week to the growing educational programs at what was now officially known as the Abigail Whitfield House and Underground Railroad Museum. As the children filed off the bus, Sarah greeted their teacher, a young woman who had specifically requested this field trip after reading about the discovery in a national education journal. "We've been studying the Underground Railroad all month," the teacher explained enthusiastically. "The children have so many questions about how Abigail kept her work secret while publishing Liberty's Voice." Sarah led the group toward the visitor center, where Catherine was waiting to begin their tour. The center's main room featured carefully designed exhibits explaining Abigail's work, including facsimiles of Liberty's Voice issues, maps of known Underground Railroad routes, and interactive displays designed to help young visitors understand the risks and moral courage involved. "Before we go into the historic house and see the secret room," Sarah began, addressing the wide-eyed students, "I want you to think about something important. Abigail Whitfield had to hide her work because in her time, helping enslaved people, escape to freedom was against the law. Sometimes being brave means doing what's right, even when it's against the rules." A small hand shot up immediately. "Did she ever get caught?" "That's a great question," Sarah replied. "According to her journals, she had several close calls. Once, a slave catcher actually searched her house while she had a family hiding in a space beneath the kitchen floor. Another time, authorities suspected her of writing Liberty's Voice and searched for the printing press, but they never found the hidden room." As the tour progressed to the farmhouse, Sarah noticed a familiar black SUV pulling into the parking area. Richard Thornton emerged, alone and without his usual corporate confidence. Since the courthouse confrontation, Thornton had maintained a low profile locally, his company's development plans significantly scaled back after the public relations disaster of attempting to demolish what had turned out to be a significant historical site. Sarah excused herself while Catherine continued the tour, walking over to meet Thornton in the parking area. "Mr. Thornton," she greeted him neutrally. "This is unexpected." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Miss Parker, or should I say Director Parker now? Just Sarah is fine. What brings you here?" Thornton gazed past her at the restored farmhouse and the children filing inside. "Curiosity, I suppose. I've been hearing about the transformation. The local business council can't stop talking about the tourism boost the museum is providing." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to his visit. "My company has taken some significant hits since our disagreement," he continued. "The ethics investigation into Commissioner Davis has affected several of our projects throughout the county." "I'm sorry to hear that," Sarah replied diplomatically, though they both knew she wasn't. "In any case," Thornton said, reaching into his jacket, "I came to deliver this personally." He handed her an envelope bearing the Mapleton Valley Development letterhead. "My board of directors has authorized a substantial donation to your foundation. Consider it a gesture of community goodwill." Sarah opened the envelope to find a check for $250,000 made out to the Whitfield Heritage Foundation. "That's unexpected," she managed, studying his face for any hidden agenda. "Business adaptation," he replied with a hint of his old confidence. "We've revised our development approach to emphasize historical preservation and cultural tourism. The success of your project has demonstrated there's profit in preservation when done correctly." Sarah suspected the gesture of goodwill had more to do with rehabilitating his company's tarnished image than genuine conversion to preservation values, but the foundation could certainly use the funds to expand their educational programs. "The foundation appreciates your support," she said carefully. "I assume this comes without strings attached." Completely unrestricted," Thornton confirmed, "though we wouldn't object to appropriate recognition in your donor materials." "We can certainly arrange that," Sarah agreed. As Thornton turned to leave, she added, "Would you like a tour since you're here? The children would be fascinated to hear about how the property was almost developed instead of preserved." Thornton actually smiled at that. Perhaps another time. Today is clearly devoted to education rather than cautionary tales about development overreach. After he departed, Sarah rejoined the school group, now gathered in front of the entrance to the hidden chamber. As Catherine dramatically demonstrated how to open the concealed door, the children gasped with genuine wonder. This is where Abigail would work late at night, Catherine explained, leading them into the small room where the printing press stood. She would write and print Liberty's voice, while everyone else in the house was asleep. Then her trusted friends would distribute the publications to other abolitionists throughout the region. A small girl raised her hand. Wasn't she scared? Her journals tell us she was often frightened, Catherine acknowledged, but she wrote that her fear of doing nothing was greater than her fear of being caught. She believed that words could change minds, and changing minds was the first step to changing laws. After the tour concluded and the children departed, Sarah sat with Catherine and Dr. Washington in what had once been the farmhouse's formal parlor and now served as the Foundation's informal meeting room. Thornton made a donation, Sarah announced, showing them the check. A rather substantial one. Well, that's unexpected, Dr. Washington remarked, examining the check with raised eyebrows. He mentioned something about his company pivoting toward historical preservation and cultural tourism, Sarah explained. I suspect it's more about improving their public image after the ethics investigation made the national news. Whatever his motivation, the funds will help expand the educational program, Catherine noted pragmatically. We've had to turn away several school groups because we couldn't accommodate them. As they discussed plans for the donation, Sarah gazed out. The window at the limestone fence posts that had once guided frightened travelers to safety. Her life had taken a turn she never could have imagined when she impulsively bid on the run-down farmhouse at the sheriff's sale, but there was no denying the sense of purpose she now felt. That evening, after the last visitors had departed and the children were doing homework in the private family rooms upstairs, Sarah made her way to the hidden chamber alone. Though she now entered it almost daily as part of the educational tours, she occasionally visited in these quiet moments, trying to connect with the woman who had worked so courageously in secret. She sat at Abigail's desk, gently touching the worn wood, where the abolitionist had written her passionate arguments for freedom. On the wall hung a portrait of Abigail, a reproduction created from the tiny locket photograph that Emma had found. Now professionally enhanced and enlarged, the serious young woman in 19th-century dress gazed directly at the viewer, her expression resolute and uncompromising. "I wonder what you'd think of all this," Sarah murmured to the portrait. "Your secret. Room now welcomes dozens of visitors each day. Your words, which you had to hide, are now proudly displayed for everyone to read. The transformation of the farm had been remarkable, but the transformation in Sarah's own life was perhaps even more profound. From a struggling single mother, seeking an affordable home, to the director of a nationally recognized historical site, she had found an unexpected calling as the steward of Abigail's legacy. A knock on the open door interrupted her thoughts. Catherine stood in the doorway, a leather-bound volume in her hands. "I thought I might find you here," she said, entering the room. "I wanted to show you something we discovered while translating some of Abigail's coded journal entries." She opened the volume to a marked page. This passage is from 1862, when she feared authorities were closing in on her activities. Sarah read the carefully translated text. "I work in darkness now, uncertain if these words will ever reach their intended audience. Yet I continue in the faith that someday, when justice has finally prevailed, someone will discover this chamber and understand why I risked everything for freedom's cause. Perhaps then, when my voice can no longer be silenced by those who fear the truth, these pages will speak for me." Sarah looked up, deeply moved by the words written more than 150 years earlier. "She was writing for us," she said quietly. "She knew someday someone would find this place," Catherine nodded. "She created this hidden room, not just to conceal her work, but to preserve it for future generations. She was deliberately creating a time capsule in the hope that someday the world would be ready to hear her voice." As they closed up the historic site for the evening, Sarah stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the old farmhouse with golden light. The same light had illuminated these walls when Abigail worked in secret, risking everything for a future she would never see. Emma and Ethan joined her on the porch, their homework complete for the evening. "Can we have hot chocolate?" Ethan asked. "Hopefully, of course," Sarah replied, putting an arm around each child as they went inside to their private family kitchen, a modern space carefully hidden from the historical sections of the house. As she prepared their evening treat, Sarah reflected on how thoroughly her life had been transformed by the discovery in the root cellar. What had begun as a search for affordable housing had evolved into a mission that connected her to a courageous woman across the span of centuries. The farmhouse that had once seemed like an impulsive gamble had become both a national treasure and the most meaningful home she could have provided for her children, a place where history lived and breathed, and where courage was not just taught but demonstrated. The Whitfield farm had indeed been transformed, but its greatest achievement was perhaps the invisible one, connecting past to present, allowing a silenced voice to finally be heard, and demonstrating that doing what's right sometimes requires extraordinary courage, a lesson that would shape Emma and Ethan long after they outgrew their childhood home. "Mom, can I help give the tour to tomorrow's group?" Emma asked, warming her hands around her mug of hot chocolate. "Of course you can," Sarah replied. "Abigail's story belongs to all of us now." 2 years to the day after Sarah Parker had first discovered the hidden chamber, she stood at a podium erected on the farmhouse lawn, addressing a crowd that filled the once overgrown fields. Historians, educators, journalists, and visitors from across the country had gathered for the official dedication of the Abigail Whitfield Center for Freedom Studies, a new research facility constructed on the property with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. "When I bought this farm at a sheriff's sale, I was just looking for a home for my family," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the attentive audience. "I could never have imagined that removing old wallpaper and cleaning out a root cellar would lead us here, to a discovery that would rewrite history and create a legacy that will endure for generations." Behind her, the farmhouse stood fully restored, its white clapboard gleaming in the spring sunshine. Adjacent to it, the new research center, designed to complement the historic architecture while providing state-of-the-art facilities for scholars, was marked by a bronze plaque bearing Abigail Whitfield's words, "Let truth be told, that freedom may follow." In the front row sat Emma and Ethan, now 12 years old, beside Catherine Rodriguez and Mabel Johnson in her wheelchair. The elderly woman, now 80, had lived to see her family's legacy fully recognized and celebrated. Beside them sat Dr. Washington and Dr. Freeman, whose prompt recognition of the discovery's significance had been crucial in those first critical days. The Abigail Whitfield house has welcomed more than 50,000 visitors in the past 2 years, Sarah continued. "School children, historians, and people from all walks of life have come to learn about one woman's extraordinary courage and her commitment to justice in a time of profound moral crisis." What Sarah didn't mention was how thoroughly the discovery had transformed her own life. The former librarian was now the executive director of the Whitfield Heritage Foundation, overseeing a staff of 8 and an annual budget that had grown to over $1.2 million. She had completed a master's degree in historical preservation through an online program, finding unexpected fulfillment in her second career as the steward of Abigail's legacy. Today, we dedicate this research center not only to Abigail Whitfield, but to all those whose voices were silenced by history, the countless individuals who risked everything for freedom and justice, whose names may never be known, but whose courage changed the world. As Sarah concluded her remarks and the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the back of the crowd, Richard Thornton. Their paths had crossed occasionally in the 2 years since the courthouse confrontation, their relationship evolving from antagonism to a wary mutual respect. Thornton's company had indeed pivoted toward historic preservation, currently renovating several 19th-century buildings in downtown Mapleton into a boutique hotel that emphasized the region's history. The discovery at the Whitfield farm had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The successful preservation of the site had inspired a renewed interest in local history throughout the region. 3 other Underground Railroad sites had subsequently been identified and preserved. The County Historical Society, once operating on a shoestring budget with aging volunteers, now had paid staff and regular school programs. After the ceremony concluded and guests began touring the new research facility, a young woman approached Sarah. She introduced herself as Jasmine Williams, a doctoral student in history. "Ms. Parker, I wanted to thank you personally," she said earnestly. "My dissertation focuses on female abolitionists, and the Abigail Whitfield papers have completely transformed my research. She documented networks and methods that we previously only speculated about." "I'm just the person who found the hidden door," Sarah replied modestly. "Abigail did the hard part, but you recognize the importance of what you found," Jasmine insisted, "and you fought to preserve it when it would have been easier to take the developer's money and walk away." The young historian's words reminded Sarah of those tense days when Thornton had offered her millions for the property, a temptation that had been genuine and powerful. With 2 children to raise alone and limited financial resources, the offer had represented security and opportunity. Yet something about Abigail's courage had made it impossible to surrender her legacy for personal gain. Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned and staff began cleaning up, Catherine found Sarah sitting on the porch swing, taking a moment of quiet reflection. "Quite a journey from that first day when we examined the hidden chamber," Catherine observed, joining her. "On the swing. Sometimes I still can't believe it all happened," Sarah admitted. "Finding the chamber, the court battle, the preservation process, it feels like another lifetime." "You know," Catherine said thoughtfully, "I've been studying my ancestors' journals for 2 years now, and something struck me recently. Abigail wrote often about believing her work would be discovered when the time was right and by the person meant to find it." "She couldn't have known who would find it," Sarah pointed out. "No, but she believed in purpose, that nothing happens purely by chance," Catherine replied. "Think about it. Of all the people who might have purchased this farm, it was bought by a librarian with knowledge of historical documents and preservation, someone who immediately recognized the significance of what she found." Sarah had never considered this perspective. "You think it was somehow meant to be?" "I think Abigail would have thought so," Catherine smiled. In her last journal entry, she wrote something that's always stayed with me. "I may not live to see justice prevail, but I trust that my words will find their way to those who will continue the work when the time is right." The thought was both humbling and profound. The idea that across more than a century, Abigail had somehow entrusted her legacy to the future, to Sarah, who had indeed continued the work by ensuring her voice would finally be heard. As evening approached, the last visitors departed, leaving the historic site peaceful once more. Sarah walked through the familiar rooms of the farmhouse, now a museum on the main floor, but still her family's home in the private upstairs rooms. The dual purpose of the space had required creative solutions, but the foundation had been committed to maintaining the property as a living history site rather than a static museum. In the kitchen, once the heart of the working farm, and now restored to its 19th century appearance, Emma was showing a visiting historian's daughter how to use the hand pump that brought water from the well. People had to work really hard just to get water for cooking and cleaning, Emma explained, with the confidence of a seasoned tour guide. Abigail would have used this pump many times every day. Sarah paused in the doorway, struck by how naturally her daughter had absorbed the history of the place. Emma and Ethan had initially been upset about sharing their home with visitors and researchers, but they had gradually embraced their unique role as the youngest caretakers of Abigail's legacy. They understood, in their own way, that they were part of something larger than themselves. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the family was alone in their private quarters, Sarah brought out a special surprise, a cake decorated with 2-year anniversary in blue icing. 2 years since we found the secret room, Ethan exclaimed, remembering the exact date without prompting. It feels like we've lived here forever, Emma added, claiming the slice with the most icing. As they enjoyed their small celebration, Sarah reflected on how completely the discovery had changed their lives. What had begun as a desperate gamble on an affordable home had evolved into a mission and purpose none of them could have imagined. The financial struggles that had once dominated her thoughts had been replaced by the challenges of managing a nationally recognized historical site, challenges that were demanding but deeply fulfilling. "Mom," Emma said suddenly, "do you think there are other secret rooms in other houses that nobody has found yet?" "I'm sure there are," Sarah replied. "History is full of secrets waiting to be discovered." "Maybe I'll find one someday," Ethan mused. "Like you did." Sarah smiled at her son's comment, thinking about the unlikely chain of events that had led her to the hidden chamber. How many other historical treasures were waiting in attics, basements, and behind walls, their significance unknown to their current owners? How many other voices from the past were waiting to be heard? Later that night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing plans for the coming year's educational programs. The Whitfield Heritage Foundation had recently received a major grant to develop curriculum materials about the Underground Railroad, focusing on women's roles in the abolitionist movement. Schools across the country would soon be teaching Abigail's story alongside those of more well-known historical figures. Through the window, Sarah could see the research center illuminated by security lights, its modern lines a striking contrast to the historic farmhouse. Inside those walls, scholars would pore over Abigail's journals and publications, extracting insights that would reshape historical understanding of resistance to slavery. On her desk sat a framed photograph taken on the day they had discovered the hidden chamber, Sarah and the twins standing wide-eyed before the dusty printing press, not yet understanding the significance of what they had found. Beside it stood a modern reproduction of Liberty's Voice, meticulously recreated from Abigail's preserved copies and now available for visitors to purchase in the gift shop. Sarah picked up the reproduction, reading the opening lines of an article from 1855. "Let no person claim ignorance as a defense against injustice. To know of freedom denied to any person and remain silent is to become complicit in that denial. There comes a time when silence is betrayal, and that time is always now." Abigail's words, once revolutionary and dangerous, now adorned posters, bookmarks, and T-shirts in the visitor center gift shop. Her call for moral courage in the face of injustice had transcended her time to speak to new generations. The woman who had worked in secrecy, risking everything for her principles, had finally found the audience she deserved. As Sarah prepared for bed, she paused at the window overlooking the farmyard, where the limestone fence posts stood as silent witnesses to history. Those same posts had guided frightened travelers to safety, had watched as Abigail worked by candlelight printing words of freedom, had endured as the farm passed from owner to owner, and now stood as markers of a legacy preserved. The Whitfield farm had been transformed from a neglected property facing development into a nationally recognized historical site. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had been in Sarah herself, from a single mother struggling to provide for her children to the steward of a legacy that would endure for generations. As she drifted off to sleep in the same house, where Abigail had once hidden her revolutionary printing press, Sarah felt a profound connection across time to a woman who had risked everything to fight injustice, trusting that someday someone would find her hidden work and ensure her voice would finally be heard. The legacy of the Whitfield farm wasn't just in the preserved buildings or artifacts, but in the continuing impact of Abigail's courage, inspiring new generations to recognize that standing for truth often requires extraordinary courage, and that one person's commitment to justice can echo across centuries, changing lives in ways they could never imagine. Sometimes the most powerful discoveries aren't grand treasures, but hidden truths that change our understanding of the past and shape our vision for the future. Sarah Parker bought a forgotten farm at a sheriff's sale looking for a home, but what she found was a legacy and a purpose that transformed not just the property, but her life and our collective history. If this story has inspired you, remember to look beneath the surface of the ordinary. You never know what extraordinary revelations might be waiting to be discovered. 5 years had passed since Sarah Parker first discovered the hidden chamber beneath her farmhouse. What had begun as a local historical curiosity had evolved into a nationally recognized center for underground railroad research and education. On this bright autumn morning, Sarah stood beside the governor as he cut the ribbon on the newest addition to the Whitfield complex, a state-of-the-art educational pavilion designed to accommodate the ever-increasing number of school groups visiting the site. This pavilion represents our state's commitment to preserving the complete history of our region, the governor announced to the assembled crowd. The Abigail Whitfield House has become a model for how historical sites can engage with their communities and provide meaningful educational experiences for visitors of all ages. As applause rippled through the audience, Sarah glanced at her children standing in the front row. Emma and Ethan, now 15, had grown up alongside the expanding historical site. What had once been an impulsive purchase at a sheriff's sale had become the defining element of their childhood and had shaped their interests and ambitions in unexpected ways. The governor continued, "What makes this site truly special is not just the remarkable preservation of Abigail Whitfield's printing press and Underground Railroad documentation, but the way her story continues to inspire new generations to understand the power of moral courage in the face of injustice." After the ceremony concluded, Sarah led a private tour for the governor and key donors through the original farmhouse. The home's main floor remained meticulously preserved as a museum space, while the family continued to live in the private upstairs quarters. The dual purpose of the building had created logistical challenges over the years, but had ultimately enhanced the site's authenticity as a living history location. "The printing press remains exactly where we found it," Sarah explained as they entered the hidden chamber, now accessible through a carefully designed entryway that protected the artifacts while making them viewable to visitors. Our conservators determined that moving it would risk damage to both the press and the historical context. The hidden room that had once been filled with dust and silence now buzzed with carefully controlled lighting and humidity systems, preserving the fragile papers and equipment for future generations. Glass cases displayed selected issues of Liberty's Voice, while interactive screens allowed visitors to explore digitized versions of Abigail's journals and publications. "It's remarkable to think this remained hidden for over a century," the governor commented, examining the printing press. "How many other historical treasures might still be waiting to be discovered in old buildings across our state?" "That's actually become something of a movement," Sarah replied. "Since our discovery was publicized, similar hidden spaces have been found in at least 12 other historic homes in the region. Nothing quite as significant as Abigail's printing press, but each one adds to our understanding of the past." Indeed, the Whitfield effect, as historians had dubbed it, had inspired property owners across the country to examine their historic homes more carefully. Several minor but interesting discoveries had made national news, including a collection of Civil War letters found behind a wall in Georgia and a cache of Prohibition-era bottles in a hidden basement compartment in Chicago. As the VIP guests departed, Sarah found herself momentarily alone in the visitor center. The modern building, constructed 3 years after the initial discovery, now welcomed over 75,000 visitors annually. Interactive exhibits explained the Underground Railroad network, the risks faced by those who assisted escaped slaves, and the particular dangers Abigail had confronted as a female publisher of abolitionist materials. A wall of photographs documented the site's transformation from neglected farmhouse to national landmark. Sarah paused before an image of herself and the twins standing on the porch the day after the courthouse confrontation, exhausted but triumphant, having successfully defended their right to preserve Abigail's legacy rather than surrender it. To development, quite a journey, isn't it? Catherine Rodriguez appeared beside her, now a permanent fixture at the site as the Foundation's research director. Her academic career had shifted from Boston University to the local state college, where she had established a program in women's history focusing on activism and resistance. "Sometimes I still can't believe it all happened," Sarah admitted. "Remember when we thought success would be just preserving the printing press and maybe getting a historical marker?" Catherine laughed. "And now we have a research center, educational pavilion, visitor center, publication series, and a waiting list of scholars applying for fellowships." The Whitfield Heritage Foundation now employed 23 full-time staff, including historians, educators, preservation specialists, and administrators. Its annual budget had grown to $3.8 million, funded through a combination of endowment, income, grants, admission fees, and donations. The site had been featured in documentaries on PBS and the History Channel, and Finding Abigail, the book Sarah and Catherine had co-authored about the discovery, had become required reading in many college history courses. "The school buses are arriving," Catherine noted, glancing at her watch. "Today's the big day for Emma, isn't it?" Sarah nodded proudly. "Her first solo tour as an official junior docent. She's been practicing all week." They watched through the window as 3 buses unloaded middle school students from a neighboring county. Emma, now tall and confident, stepped forward to greet the first group, wearing the blue polo shirt that identified the site's educational staff. "Welcome to the Abigail Whitfield house," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "My name is Emma, and I have a unique perspective on this historic site because I was there when we discovered the hidden chamber 5 years ago. In fact, I was the one who found the locket that started us on this incredible journey." Sarah felt a surge of pride watching her daughter engage so naturally with the visitors. Growing up alongside a developing historical site had shaped Emma in profound ways. While most teenagers rebelled against their parents' interests, Emma had embraced Abigail's legacy, recently announcing her intention to study history and museum management in college. Ethan had been influenced differently by their unusual home life. His bedroom wall featured architectural drawings of the various buildings on the property, and he had developed a passionate interest in historic preservation. Already he was taking college-level courses in architectural history through an online program, his sights set on a career in preservation architecture. As the day's tours proceeded, Sarah retreated to her office in the research center to focus on administrative work. The foundation's success had gradually transformed her role from hands-on educator to executive director, a transition that sometimes took her away from the aspects of the work she found most fulfilling. Today's tasks included reviewing grant applications for the coming year and finalizing the budget for a new digital archive project. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. Dr. Freeman, now semi-retired but still actively involved with the foundation as a board member, entered with obvious excitement. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, placing a file folder on her desk. "Catherine's team has been translating more of Abigail's coded journal entries, and they've made a remarkable discovery." Sarah opened the folder to find photocopies of journal pages with translation notes in the margins. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence that Abigail wasn't working alone," Dr. Freeman explained. "These entries document a network of at least 6 other women in neighboring counties who were involved in publishing and distributing Liberty's Voice. Women whose contributions to the abolitionist movement have been completely unknown until now." This revelation immediately captured Sarah's full attention. From the beginning, one of the most significant aspects of their discovery had been documenting women's leadership roles in abolitionist activities, challenging the historical narrative that had often relegated women to supporting positions, rather than recognizing them as principal actors. "This could change our understanding of how resistance networks operated," Sarah said, quickly grasping the implications. "If we can identify these women and research their backgrounds." "Catherine is already on it," Dr. Freeman confirmed. "She's assembled a research team to trace these individuals through census records and local histories. 2 of them appear to have been prominent in their communities, which makes their secret abolitionist work even more remarkable." This discovery represented exactly why the preservation of the Whitfield farm had been so important. Beyond the physical artifacts, Abigail's documentation continued to yield new insights that transformed historical understanding of resistance movements and women's roles within them. Later that afternoon, as visitors departed and staff prepared to close the site for the day, Sarah found Emma sitting on the farmhouse porch, her official tour duties complete. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, joining her daughter on the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for conversations. "It was amazing," Emma replied, her eyes bright with excitement. "When I told them about finding the locket and then discovering the hidden room, they had so many questions. One girl asked if I was scared when Mr. Thornton tried to take our house away. And what did you say?" "I told her the truth, that I was terrified we'd lose our home, but that sometimes standing up for what's right means taking risks, just like Abigail did." Sarah smiled, recognizing Abigail's influence on her daughter's worldview. The parallels between their situations, separated by 150 years, but connected by a common thread of courage, had not been lost on the children as they grew up. That evening, after the staff had departed and the security systems were activated, the Parker family gathered in their private kitchen for dinner. This space, modern and functional while hidden from public view, represented the careful balance they maintained between living in a historical landmark and having a normal family life. "I heard about the new discovery," Ethan said as they ate. "The network of women publishers. That's going to be a big deal, isn't it?" "Potentially groundbreaking," Sarah confirmed. It suggests resistance networks were more organized and woman-led than previously recognized. "Will you add new exhibits about them?" Emma asked. "Eventually, once the research is more complete," Sarah explained. That's how historical understanding evolves, layer by layer, as we uncover new evidence and make new connections. After dinner, Sarah retreated to the farmhouse porch with a cup of tea, enjoying a rare moment of solitude as the sun set over the property. The 5 years since discovering the hidden chamber had passed in a blur of preservation work, fundraising, educational program development, and administrative challenges. The site had grown faster than anyone anticipated, bringing both opportunities and complications. From her vantage point, Sarah could see the entire complex, the historic farmhouse at its center, surrounded by the carefully designed new buildings that supported its mission. The research center with its distinctive copper roof gleamed in the fading light. The educational pavilion, just opened that morning, stood ready to welcome tomorrow's school groups. And on the far side of the property, the foundation had recently purchased an additional 10 acres as a buffer against future development, ensuring Abigail's legacy would remain in a setting that respected its historical context. Beyond the immediate, in property, the impact of their discovery had rippled outward in ways Sarah could never have predicted. The successful preservation fight had inspired similar efforts throughout the region. 3 nearby historic properties had been saved from development and repurposed as cultural sites. The county had revised its zoning regulations to provide stronger protections for historically significant properties. Even Richard Thornton's company had eventually embraced historic preservation as a core business value, renovating several 19th-century commercial buildings in downtown Mapleton rather than replacing them with modern structures. As darkness fell, Sarah made her way back. Inside, pausing as she always did beside the concealed door that led to Abigail's secret chamber. Though she had now entered that room thousands of times, she still felt a sense of wonder at the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her here. An impulsive bid at a sheriff's sale, a child's discovery of a tarnished locket, a moment of curiosity about an odd variation in mortar color. Each seemingly small decision had led to this transformed reality, where a forgotten voice from the past had found its audience, and a struggling single mother had found her purpose. The Whitfield farm's expansion had physically manifested what Sarah had known intuitively from the beginning, that Abigail's legacy deserved to be preserved, protected, and shared with the world. As she climbed the stairs to the family's private quarters, Sarah reflected that the most meaningful expansion wasn't in the buildings or programs, but in how Abigail's story continued to grow and evolve, reaching new audiences and revealing new dimensions of courage in the face of injustice, a legacy that expanded hearts and minds, challenging each visitor to consider what truths they might be willing to stand for, regardless of the cost. A decade had passed since Sarah Parker had first pressed against that oddly colored section of mortar in her root cellar, revealing the hidden chamber that would change everything. On this warm summer evening, the grounds of the Abigail Whitfield Historic Site were illuminated with tasteful landscape lighting as hundreds of guests gathered for a special anniversary gala, celebrating 10 years of preservation, education, and research. Under an elegant tent erected on what had once been an overgrown field, tables were arranged around a small stage. Photographs documenting the site's evolution lined the perimeter. From the dilapidated farmhouse Sarah had impulsively purchased at sheriff's sale to the nationally recognized complex it had become, now encompassing the original house, research center, educational pavilion, visitor center, and newly completed archive building. Sarah, now 44, stood at the podium wearing a formal dress that contrasted sharply with the work clothes she'd worn that first day while exploring the root cellar. As she gazed out at the assembled guests, historians, donors, politicians, and community members who had supported the Foundation's work, she felt a profound sense of how completely her life had been transformed by that single moment of discovery. 10 years ago today, my children and I found a hidden door in the root cellar of what was supposed to be just an affordable fixer-upper, she began, her voice steady with the confidence gained from years of public speaking. We had no idea that pushing on that door would open not just a hidden room, but a hidden chapter of American history and completely redirect the course of our lives. In the front row sat Emma and Ethan, now 18, and both preparing to leave for college in the fall. Emma had been accepted to Georgetown University's history program, with plans to minor in museum studies. Ethan would attend the Rhode Island School of Design, focusing on historic preservation architecture. Their childhood surrounded by historians, preservationists and educators had shaped them in ways Sarah could never have anticipated when she'd scraped together her savings for the down payment on the old farmhouse. What began as a simple desire to save our home from development has evolved into a mission that has far exceeded our wildest dreams, Sarah continued. The Abigail Whitfield Center has welcomed over 500,000 visitors in the past decade. Our research fellowships have supported scholars whose work has fundamentally changed our understanding of women's roles in abolitionist movements. And most importantly, Abigail's voice, silenced for over a century, now reaches new audiences every day, inspiring them with her courage and conviction. As Sarah spoke, her gaze fell on faces that represented different chapters in the Foundation's evolution. Catherine Rodriguez, now an internationally recognized expert on women abolitionists, sat beside her husband and teenage son, who had become regular visitors to the farm. Dr. Freeman, well into his 70s but still sharp-minded, beamed with grandfatherly pride. Mabel Johnson, now 88 and in a wheelchair, had insisted on attending despite her fragility, representing the blood connection to Abigail that had added such significance to their preservation efforts. Most surprisingly, Richard Thornton was present, seated at a table with other major donors. The former adversary had gradually become an ally, his company's substantial annual contributions helping fund the scholarship program that brought underprivileged students to experience the historic site. What had begun as a corporate image, rehabilitation effort had apparently evolved into genuine support for the Foundation's educational mission. Tonight, I'm pleased to announce the next phase in our journey, Sarah continued, reaching the purpose of the evening's gathering. Thanks to an extraordinary anonymous donation, the Abigail Whitfield Center will establish a permanent endowment ensuring that her legacy will be preserved and shared for generations to come. Applause rippled through the audience as Sarah revealed the amount, $10 million, the largest gift in the Foundation's history. What she didn't share was that the anonymous donor was actually Richard Thornton, who had insisted his name be kept off the announcement. His private comment to her earlier that evening had been revealing. Consider it atonement for almost bulldozing a national treasure. After the formal program concluded, guests mingled under the stars, touring illuminated pathways that connected the various buildings comprising the historic site. Sarah found herself standing beside Catherine near the limestone fence posts that had once guided Underground Railroad passengers to safety. Do you ever wonder what Abigail would think of all this? Catherine asked, gesturing toward the complex of buildings that had grown around the original farmhouse. Constantly, Sarah admitted. I think she'd be stunned that her secret work is now celebrated, that words she had to hide are now taught in classrooms across the country, and that her home is now on the National Register of Historic Places with a multi-million-dollar endowment. Catherine added with a smile, That too, Sarah laughed, though I suspect she'd be most pleased that her story continues to inspire young women to stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost. As if on cue, Emma approached, accompanied by a group of teenage girls from the Foundation's summer internship program. These young women, selected from across the country for their interest in history and social justice, spent 6 weeks each summer learning about preservation, research methods, and public history while assisting with tours and educational programs. "Mom, could you tell them about the courthouse confrontation?" Emma asked. "They've heard my version, but you're the one who actually faced down Mr. Thornton." Sarah smiled at her daughter's request. That pivotal moment had become something of a legend among the staff and volunteers, the dramatic turning point when the historical designation had been revealed just in time to save the property from development. As Sarah recounted the story, she was struck by how much time had softened its edges. Richard Thornton, once cast as the villain in their personal drama, was now chatting amiably with donors across the lawn. Commissioner Davis, whose ethics violation had been substantiated, had long since left office, eventually replaced by a preservationist who had strengthened the county's historical protection ordinances. Later that evening, as the gala wound down and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself drawn once more to the hidden chamber where everything had begun. Though now a carefully preserved museum space, she still sometimes visited alone after hours, trying to connect with the woman whose courage had shaped so many lives across the span of centuries. The printing press stood silent in the carefully controlled environment, the same machine that had once produced words of freedom under cover of darkness. Sarah ran her fingers lightly over Abigail's desk, thinking about how many lives had been changed by what had happened in this small room, not just in Abigail's time, but in her own. "Mom?" Ethan's voice called from the doorway. "There's something we want to show you." Sarah followed her son upstairs to what had once been the farmhouse's formal parlor and now served as a special exhibits gallery. Emma waited there, standing, beside a cloth-covered display that hadn't been there earlier in the day. "We've been working on this for months," Emma explained with barely contained excitement. "It's our gift to celebrate the 10th anniversary." Together, the twins removed the cloth to reveal a beautifully crafted display case containing a timeline of the Whitfield farm's history. What made it special was the focus, not just on Abigail's era, but on the decade since Sarah and the children had discovered the hidden chamber. Photographs documented key moments: Sarah examining the printing press for the first time, the courthouse confrontation with Thornton, the official historic designation ceremony, the groundbreaking for the research center, Emma and Ethan giving their first tours as junior docents, international scholars visiting the archives, school children gathered in the educational pavilion. "We wanted to show that our family's story is now part of the farm's history too," Ethan explained. "That Abigail's legacy lives on, not just through her artifacts, but through how discovering them changed our lives and the lives of so many visitors." Sarah stood, speechless, deeply moved by her children's thoughtfulness and their mature understanding of how thoroughly their lives had been shaped by that chance discovery a decade earlier. "The best part is at the end," Emma urged, directing Sarah's attention to the final section of the timeline. There, in a small display niche, sat the tarnished silver locket with the initials AW that Emma had found by the stone wall, the first tangible connection to Abigail that had ultimately led them to the hidden chamber. "We asked the board's permission to make this part of the permanent exhibition," Ethan explained. "Catherine helped us research its provenance completely. It definitely belonged to Abigail, given to her by her father when she went away to school in Philadelphia. But how it ended up by the stone wall where Emma found it remains a mystery," Sarah noted, familiar with this one remaining puzzle in Abigail's story. That's what makes it special, Emma said thoughtfully. It's almost like Abigail wanted us to find it, like she was reaching across time to make sure her story would finally be told. The idea wasn't as fanciful as it might have seemed 10 years earlier. Sarah had come to appreciate the strange convergence of circumstances that had brought her family to this place at this particular moment in history. The only bidder at a sheriff's sale, the discovery of the locket, finding the hidden door that generations of previous owners had somehow missed or chosen not to reveal. The following morning, after the gala cleanup was complete and the staff had departed for a well-deserved day off, Sarah sat on the farmhouse porch with Emma and Ethan, enjoying a rare, quiet moment together. In just 2 months, both would be leaving for college, marking the end of their childhood at the historic site that had shaped them so profoundly. I was thinking about when we first moved in, Ethan reflected. Remember how disappointed we were that the house didn't have air conditioning or updated bathrooms, Emma laughed. And now we give tours explaining why preserving the original architecture is so important. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found the hidden room? Sarah asked, curious about her children's perspective on the journey that had defined their family for a decade. I think about it sometimes, Emma admitted. We'd probably be living in a normal house in town. You'd still be a librarian. I probably wouldn't be majoring in history, and I wouldn't be going into preservation architecture, Ethan added. It's strange to think how one discovery completely redirected all our lives. As they continued reminiscing, a school bus pulled into the parking area, an unusual sight on a day when the site was closed to regular visitors. Sarah recognized it immediately as part of the Foundation's Special Access Program, which provided free tours to underserved schools and community groups. That must be the group from the Hamilton Center, she realized, referring to a residential facility for children in foster care. The Foundation had recently expanded its outreach to include special tours for children who might not otherwise have access to cultural and historical resources. I'll handle it, Emma offered, already rising from her seat. You two keep talking. Sarah watched with pride as her daughter greeted the children, her natural warmth and enthusiasm immediately evident, even from a distance. Emma had developed into a gifted educator, able to make history accessible and relevant to visitors of all ages. Though she would soon leave for college, Sarah knew Emma would remain connected to the center that had played such a formative role in her life. She's amazing with kids, Ethan observed. Do you think she'll come back here after college? Work for the Foundation full-time? I don't know, Sarah replied honestly. I hope both of you will follow whatever paths fulfill you, even if they lead away from here. But the farm will always be home, Ethan said with certainty, even if we're studying or working elsewhere. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The Whitfield farm had become far more than a property or even a historical site. It was the physical embodiment of their family's journey, the place where they had all discovered their purposes and passions. As Emma led the children toward the visitor center to begin their tour, Sarah reflected on how completely the circles of influence had expanded over the decade. From Abigail's solitary work in the hidden chamber to a nationally recognized center for education and research, from a desperate fight to save their home to a permanently endowed institution, from a struggling single mother's impulsive purchase to a family legacy of preservation and education. Later that day, as the summer sun began to set, Sarah walked the perimeter of the property alone, following the line of limestone fence posts that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. These simple markers had once guided frightened travelers to safety along the Underground Railroad. Later they had marked the boundaries of a family farm. Now they stood as silent witnesses to how thoroughly the past could shape the present when its stories were preserved rather than paved over. Near the rear boundary, she paused at the exact spot where Emma had found Abigail's locket 10 years earlier. The discovery that had started everything. a tarnished piece of silver with the initials AW that had led them to uncover a hidden chamber, a forgotten voice, and ultimately their own purpose. Looking back toward the farmhouse, now bathed in golden evening light, Sarah could see the full scope of what had grown from that single moment of discovery. The original house stood at the center, surrounded by thoughtfully designed new buildings that supported its mission while respecting its historical significance. Visitors moved between them on carefully planned pathways, each element working together to preserve and share Abigail's legacy. The circle had indeed come full. What Abigail had hidden in secrecy and fear was now celebrated openly. What Sarah had purchased as simply an affordable home had become a nationally significant historic site. And most importantly, the courage that had driven Abigail to risk everything for justice continued to inspire new generations through the preserved record of her work. As darkness fell and the landscape lighting illuminated the property's features, Sarah made her way back to the farmhouse that had been at the center of this remarkable journey. Despite all the changes and expansions, it remained the heart of both the historic site and her family's life, a place where past and present converged, where a hidden legacy had been revealed, and where the future would continue to be shaped by the courage of a woman who had dared to speak truth when others remained silent. 10 years after pushing on that oddly colored section of mortar in the root cellar, Sarah Parker stood on the porch of what was now officially the Abigail Whitfield House and Underground Railroad Museum, a site visited by thousands each year. But for her, it would always be the place where a forgotten voice from the past had reached across time to change the future, creating ripples of influence that continued to expand in ways no one could have predicted when a single mother and her twins became the unlikely guardians of a historical treasure that had waited generations to be found. Sometimes the most profound discoveries don't come from professional archaeologists or historians, but from ordinary people who recognize the value in what others have overlooked. Sarah Parker didn't set out to uncover a national treasure or create a renowned historical site. She was simply a mother trying to provide a home for her children. But when the hidden door revealed itself, she chose to preserve rather than exploit, to protect rather than profit. And in doing so, she not only saved Abigail's legacy, but created a new one for her own family. If this story has taught us anything, it's that history isn't just in museums and textbooks. It might be hiding behind the walls of an old house, waiting for someone with the curiosity to find it and the courage to share it with the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.